This video is sponsored by Bespoke Post. I honestly didn't think I would ever build another shuffleboard table. Never mind by myself. It's a beast of a project that doesn't really fit in my shop. But when I got the commission request, I just couldn't say no. And luckily, I was able to borrow some shop space when I needed it, and I came up with a game plan to get it done. I also enlisted a few friends with the heavy stuff, so with that said, challenge accepted.
Oh, sawhorse up. Oh boy.
Now, because this shuffleboard table was going to be built for a corporation, they wanted their corporate logo in the center, which looks like this. Now, I needed to make this out of epoxy. So my plan was to do an inlay in MDF, cut that out with the shaper, and then inlay it in the table. So I needed to make a couple of samples. Well, many samples. So, Total Boat, baby. Of course, I grabbed my Total Boat high performance epoxy with some white pigment dispersion because, as my buddy Derek always says,
yeah, dude, you gotta put white down first with MDF, so don't even f around.
Words to live by. So the white gives a nice reflective background just in case any of these pigments aren't completely opaque. And then using a torch, I make sure I get out any of the air bubbles. And while I had the Shaper Origin out, I figured, hey, I might as well cut the leg template for the legs. So I dropped it in my Shaper hub and positioned it on my plywood and made the cut. Then I could unscrew it, remove the tape, and there you go. One leg template. Okay, rather than subjecting you to the same pain that I just went through milling and then stacking and stickering all this lumber over here, I'm going to show you exactly why you want to stack and sticker your lumber after the first pass and then come back a day or two later for the final pass. There are also these 9-footers here, which I face jointed and then ran through the planer to get me 2 parallel sides. I'm going to use the track saw to get a straight line rip on all of these, and then the track saw again because I cannot fit a 9-foot piece through my table saw because of the wall behind me. There are also these pieces here that need ripped. This is going to be the frame for our shuffleboard table. So over here, these were our stacked and stickered boards. They were nice and flat, but look at this. You can see already that's a 16th plus gap, so that means that this material started to de-stressify and move and twist. So now I can hit it again with a final milling pass before I glue up for the blanks of the shuffleboard table legs. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these longer boards had a lot of tension in them, which caused them to banana this way and that. So I actually had a lot of waste, much more than intended. So I ended up having to go get more lumber. But in the meantime, I got all this ripped down and then stood them up and stacked them like a nice set of walnut soldiers. And then it was over to the joiner to put a nice, fresh, jointed face, flattened face now on my wood that had acclimated. And then I could transform this machine over to a planer and get a parallel side on the other side. And because there was a nice tailwind out there, I hopped in my hot air balloon and commuted with the rest of the hot air ballooners over to my buddy Kevin's shop from Fine Point Cabinetry. You've seen me work there before, and I'm going to be doing a lot of work there. So here we go, where I could rip the playing deck boards to final width. And as you can see, it was still getting a little funky in there with this tension and all this walnut. But I got them all ripped down with a nice fresh edge. Then I could clamp them and transfer them over to the bench, where I would bust out the domino. Now again, I know people love hearing this, but I'm just using these for alignment because I've built one of these before, and I know it's a pain in the butt to try to get all these individual boards flush on the top, and the domino takes a little more work, but it saves you a ton of time during the glue up. Speaking of glue ups, let's bust out the gallon of Tite Bond here and spread it all around. I'm using this big wide roller, silicone roller from Rockler, which works pretty good in this situation. And then I can pop in all my dominoes. Dinka, 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 dinka. And then flip, rotate, insert, snap. And then it was clamp time. And because these boards were a little wonky here and there, I was definitely going to need an armada of clamps. A various selection of different brands and types, sizes. But you got to have these things nice and tight to get that squeeze out, which, as you can see here, I'm just scraping it all off before it hardens, because I've found that is the easiest. But look at this. Oh, God, what a mess. Oh, I should have broken out the double wide putty knife to get all this off, but It'll save me the hassle and trouble of scraping off all that hardened glue nuggets later on. And then it's back to my shop. This time I took the dirt bike. Let's get to work on laying out the templates on our leg blanks, and then we can get those cut out. Now, grain selection is pretty important on these because you're going to see the sides and the ends. So I took my time and laid out the upper branch of the Y as well as the big meaty part of the leg here. I tried to take the parts for each leg out of the same board to keep grain and color consistent. And then it was over the bandsaw to kind of rough these out. Unfortunately, I had my resaw blade in here, which does not work well for cutting curves, and I got stuck. Yeah, really stuck, as in 2 screwdriver stuck. So I tried to wedge this thing and pull it out and wedge it some more, and it finally came apart when I split it. So once my blade was cut free of its shackles, I could get back to nipping away at all of these, still with the wrong blade. And here are all my parts. Well, wait a second. Are these all my parts? There's 4 legs on this table, dude. Oh, God. Well, take my word for it. I made a whole nother set, and then I could get going on assembly. Now, just like I used the domino for the top for the alignment, I'm doing the same thing here, just so these pieces aren't sliding all around as I try to glue them up. A lot of people recommend using salt or other things, but I've never had any luck with that. The domino just always works for me. So I only needed a couple there. And then spread some glue, roll it around. This is actually a little silicone roller from Woodcraft, which makes nice little track marks like I used to make with my fork and my mashed potatoes as a kid. And then these just pop right together perfectly. I know they're not going to move around. And then the armada of clamps came out. So I glued up one, which I'll show you here, and then some lovely off-camera footage of the others. And then it was back to Kevin's shop. This time it was a nice day, so I hopped on my bicycle and headed that way, where I could declamp the first half of the shuffleboard deck playing surface. And let's put this over here out of the way. Oh, you know what? Let's run it through the planer first. And again, big thanks to Kevin for letting me use his shop and some of his equipment, because my shop is just too small. Man, that grain looks good. So with the first half glued up and surfaced, I could set this over here and then grab my boards to start the second one. And just like the first half, I put some domino slots in there, spread some glue, rolled some glue, and then snapped my pieces together and did a whole lot of clamping. Now, not only are Kevin's floors slippery, this planer is super heavy and I have no traction on my shoes. This was not for the camera. This is really how it went down. Let's move that out of the way and then head back to my shop. This time, I took the motorboat. Felt like having that ocean breeze blow through my hair. Then it was time to glue up the small parts of the legs, but first, yeah, it's fresh. Let's refill this bottle here and then start gluing these little guys up. Now you can see there's like these little right angle jut out things. Those are basically clamping blocks, which will allow me to give perfect 90-degree clamping pressure when I glue this part of the leg to the larger part of the leg. And just like the larger part of the leg, I needed just as many clamps and got just as much squeeze out. And because the engine was still warm, I just hopped back in the boat and cruised back over to Kevin's shop, where it was a little chilly inside, as you can see from my jacket. But the glue was dry, and then I just used a cabinet scraper to scrape off all those glue globules from the surface. And then a little tip here, in case you're worried about snipe on your planer, I used some tape and CA glue to attach these little outriggers or extensions, and these will absorb any snipe on each end of the infeed and outfeed when I run this through the planer. And then, with Kevin's help, we could run this thing through the jointer and get a nice square flat edge on this beast. We did the same with the other piece, so now I had 2 flat square edges to join together, and again with the domino, just to help me with alignment and making sure that these 2 slabs come nice and flush on the top. And then it was simply just some glue, some dominoes, and then of course, clamps. Still lots of clamps. Not as many clamps, but still lots. And while that was drying, I could get to work on cutting the rabbet in the large outer frame of the shuffleboard table. So this is 10 feet long and the ends are about 28 inches or so. So I had to make one pass with the dado stack, move the fence over, and then make the final pass. And what is this rabbit for? Well, it's going to house the long piece of plywood that the playing deck is going to sit on. And then it was time to cut the miters on these pieces. It seemed the simplest way was on the miter saw. So I did a bunch of test pieces, making sure this was dialed in perfectly. And then I made all my cuts, because I only got one shot with this. It needed to be a certain length and width. And there you go. You can see a nice little bow in this one. Complete with sound effects. And since the next step was gluing up this frame, I wanted to make sure I gave the inside faces a good sanding, because it would be a little more difficult once it was all together. And then I could mortise for my dominoes, because I've found with miters the easiest and best way to get these to come together perfectly in alignment without slipping and sliding around is using the domino for alignment. And in this case, we have an actual miter, end grain to end grain. It's going to add strength. Now, before I find myself in any kind of a glue-up pickle, I did a nice dry fit of everything first. And as you can see, I glued in one side of the domino first. That will save me a little time and headache during the final glue-up. But I really wanted to make sure that everything was going to come together nice and tight and even before I started slinging any glue. And luckily, it did. Now, if you happen to catch the last collaboration shuffleboard table I did with Jason and Nick, we had a bit of a glue clamping circus because we didn't put any clamping blocks on the side. So I got smart this time and did it right from the get-go, just using some CA glue to tack these on. And because the plywood is softer than the walnut, after everything is glued up, I'll just be able to knock these things off without any damage to the actual walnut frame. And luckily, Kevin was, in his own shop working and was happy to help me get these glued up. Definitely much easier and reduces the stress when you're trying to glue up a piece of this size to have another set of hands helping you. So we'll check for square, kind of make sure the spacing in the middle is even, and then it was up to the glue to work its magic. And because I was so invigorated and full of energy, I hopped on the bicycle and headed back to my shop. All right, I gotta do that next. Oh, but first, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, Bespoke Post. What is Bespoke Post, you say? Well, Bespoke Post is a monthly membership club delivering a box of awesome, top shelf goods from under-the-radar brands. And it's free to join. Now, every month, they introduce their members to cool new products, and they cater the items to what you want because, well, we're all quite picky. And each box of awesome has around $70 in value, but you only pay a fraction of that price. And 90% of the products in Bespoke Post boxes come from small brands, many of which are based right here in the US. Now, based on the quiz you take when signing up, you'll get one of these boxes of awesome assigned to you each month. And before it's shipped, you'll get a preview of what comes inside to decide if you want to keep it, swap it for a different box on offer, or just skip the month entirely for absolutely no charge. That's right, you only pay for what you want. Now, based on my quiz results, I got 3 awesome boxes. So, let's see what's inside. First up is Explore, which is a super lightweight hiking kit with a compact backpack, a water bottle, some victuals, or vittles if you want to pronounce it properly, and a cool headlamp. Now, Grow comes with a little planter box and seeds and scissors for trimming to start my own little indoor herb garden. And of course, Concentrate, which is this sweet little cold brew iced coffee maker. Because, well, I can always use a little boost of caffeine on those late nights in the shop. And it just so happens that we are knee-deep in the holiday season, and a Bespoke Post subscription is the perfect gift for the person you care about the most. It's the gift that keeps on giving, literally. So, be sure to head to bespokepost.com/KJCW20 and use code KJCW20 to grab your box of awesome and get 20% off your first box. But if you're like me and you have the memory of a doormat and you can't commit that link to memory, no worries. I've put a convenient clickable link in the description below. All right, back to the shuffleboard table, and thank you to Bespoke Post for sponsoring this video. To get the legs prepped for their final trimming and final glue up. So I jointed the back edge of the big legs and then trimmed the bottom to their final angle, which was 17 or 18 degrees. I can't quite remember. And then I built a little sled so that I could cut the Y portion of this to get me a nice square flat joint for the smaller branch to glue into. And I spent probably 30 minutes or so making this jig, using some CA glue, some blocks, because I really want this cut to be perfect. You got to remember, you're joining two pieces together with dominoes, so you really need nice flat faces and each piece to be exactly the same. And with a very helpful suggestion from Shopcat Jerry, I also installed these fancy hold-down clamps to make sure everything stayed in position and didn't move on me when I run these across the table saw. Unfortunately, even though I still swear to this day that I double-checked that my blade height with the height of the sled would still go through my legs, once I clamped this thing down and checked the blade height, it was not going to make it because my blade will only go so high. And here's the moment of frustration. I'll do that tomorrow. And so the next day I went out and bought a piece of crappy 1/4-inch plywood, made a new sled exactly like the old one, and now the blade height just cleared the thickness of my material, and I could run all 4 legs through to get me that nice, smooth, square flat cut. And then I got to work using my template to lay out the corresponding cut on the smaller branch of the Y. And you can see I'm using yellow tape here. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of green tape, but I'm finding now that the yellow tape, I can see pencil on it so much better, and it's super thin, and I'm just loving it much more than the green tape for layout. And as you can see, I also labeled them all corresponding, A, B, C, D, so they go with the correct leg. And then at the table saw, using my miter gauge, I set it to 41 degrees and made all my cuts. Now to glue these legs together, I'll be using the Festool domino again, but I wanted to use 100mm dominoes for both, but if I did that, 50mm in that right smaller portion would not make it. So I changed the depth over there to 30 and 70 on the other side where I had more meat, and then those bottom ones were equally 50mm depth on each side. Now since I'm double stacking these dominoes for added strength, I had marked out only one face, so once I had one side cut, I carried my layout lines all the way around and marked out the other side and drilled for those mortises as well. And there goes Jerry up into his loft to take a nap. And with all my mortises cut, I believe that was 32 in total, I could start spreading some glue, insert my dominoes, and then put these together. Oh, looks like I need a bigger hammer. Get that down, that was a tight fit. And now you can see where those integrated clamping blocks come in. I have a perfect square reference clamping surface to get even pressure across that joint. And while those were drying, I loaded up the shuffleboard deck and headed over to the Brothers Beardsley at True Trade Carpentry, who have a giant 5x10 Laguna CNC machine, and they did the first round of flattening on both sides of the shuffleboard playing deck. Man, does this thing make quick work. That's about a 2 1/4-inch flattening bit. Whoo! Way quicker than a hand plane. And that is looking gorgeous. And then it was back to Kevin's shop yet again to crack off these clamping blocks. And as you can see, no damage to the walnut, just some glue residue left behind, and that's easily removed with the sander. Now for the plywood substrate that the playing deck and the canvas are going to sit on, I needed something longer than an 8-foot piece of plywood, so I had to butt 2 pieces together. And that mustachio fellow there is my buddy Ryan Carlin, who helped me out for half a day here with the big stuff. And then I went back to the sliding table saw and just snipped off a piece there, and that fills in the full length that I needed. Now to join this butt joint, I'm using a combination of dominoes for the strength and the Lamello Clamex connectors, which will allow me to just turn that cam clamp and not need any clamps, which are always difficult to get on long butt joints like this. So I'll insert the connectors and then pop this thing together, and with a twist of an Allen key, those cam clamps engage and I get some nice squeeze out. And when that glue had set up, we brought it back over to insert into the rabbet, make sure everything fit nice and tight as it should. Slide it in there and whoa! Almost lost a fingernail. And then it was the long, arduous task of me pre-drilling and countersinking, and Ryan coming in with the screws. I'm using 1.5" number 8s here, and we're using lots of them. I think 60 something, maybe 50 something. In any event, it was more than sufficient to hold this piece of plywood to the frame. And then we could flip this thing over and make sure there weren't any screws that broke through the side, even though at this point it'd be a little bit late. And then over at the slider, could trim the shuffleboard deck down to its final size. And unfortunately, I couldn't do this with the track saw because mine doesn't go quite deep enough to get through this thickness. And since I wasn't in any hurry, per se, to get back to my shop, I just took the subway. And now it was time to get artsy and mix the colors for the logo. And I decided to use the thick set Total Boat Epoxy because that allows you to go a little bit deeper, and because I had about 3/8 of an inch pour here, I didn't want to generate a bunch of heat with the high performance. Now the red and the blue weren't difficult to match. I just used some blue pigment dispersion with white for the blue, and for the red, I just used red and white, and I did mix in some yellow and some orange sometimes, varying. I did so many samples that I kind of lost track. And trying to get these two colors to blend and vignette evenly was really an exercise in futility with epoxy. And yet, with my zero experience doing this kind of work, I still thought I could make it work. So you can see I put 2 pieces of cardboard as a dam separating the two colors. And I thought if I just pull those out, the colors would magically mix together. But that wasn't really happening. So I took the red and the blue and mixed them together into one color, and then tried to mix that in where the two colors meet to kind of, facilitate a little transition, and it basically just turned into mud instead. Now I did do a bunch of other samples, which I'll show you later. Now as a safety net, I had the logo printed out by my friend Beth on this Epson inkjet printer, and then it was cut perfectly on this Kongsberg plotter, and then later you'll see I poured a layer of clear epoxy over the top of it. But in the meantime, I could get these legs out of the clamps, get everything kind of trimmed off to match my template. So I'll trace that all the way around and then head over to the bandsaw to rough it out before flush trimming. And to do the actual flush trimming, I'm using X Fasten brand woodworking tape. I love this stuff to double stick tape my template down. And then using the ultimate pattern bit by Bits and Bits, I'll make one pass all the way around, flip it over, and head over to the router table using this compression flush trim bit by Bits and Bits also, and finish up that cut, making everything nice and flush and even. And then head over to the bench using the little benchtop belt sander to clean up any burn marks and any inconsistencies in the flush trimming. And once the belt sanding was done, I could swap out for this little spindle attachment and get in the tiny radius, the little armpit of this Y, clean that up nice, get all those router bit and burn marks out of there. Next up was the leg stretchers, which I cut to length using my miter gauge on the table saw, and then marked out for the mortises for the dominoes, made those cuts on both the legs and on the stretcher, but before I glued anything up, I had to cut the legs on the top to final length. To do this, I'm using the L fence attached to my fence on the table saw. Again, the track saw wouldn't go deep enough on these to make these cuts, so using a straight sacrificial board, I'll put that across my straight line, and then this will just ride along the L fence and trim this thing perfectly on my layout lines. And there you go. And you can see in the background my epoxy samples. And to break all those sharp edges on the legs, I'm using a 1/4 inch round over bit to give a nice, pleasing to the touch edge profile. And the final verdict? He's pretty stoic. Can't really tell. And I'll spare you from all the sanding, but I can tell you it was a lot. Obviously with the orbital sander on all the edges and then hand sanding all these inside edges and corners until I had 4 identical legs ready for the ball. And by the ball, I mean glue up. So let's get these stretchers and legs glued up so we can move on to other things. So with one side in, I could drop the other leg on top, break out the clamps. Only needed 2 on this, still had a little squeeze out, so I cleaned that up with a wet rag. And just to make sure everything came together right, I'm checking for square here, because even though you have flat faces, you can still skew these with the clamp. So once I knew that, it was set to dry, and then I busted out the shaper origin again to carve in all the numbers and lines into the shuffleboard deck on both ends of the table. And then I try to give Jerry the business with the vacuum. That is one thing he does not like, is the vacuum or the air compressor. Isn't that right, buddy? But he's very forgiving. Sweet, fancy Moses, more epoxy? Oh yeah, now we gotta fill in those numbers and lines that we just hollowed out with the shaper and fill them with epoxy. So we're mixing up some Total Boat, baby, and some white pigment dispersion. I'm using a syringe for a little more pinpoint accuracy. Now, a good rule of thumb when using this penetrating epoxy is to seal all the edges around there with something like shellac. That way the epoxy doesn't penetrate into the grain and cause bleed. I didn't do that here because I knew I was taking this back to the CNC to have it flattened. And then while Lola was napping in the wee hours of the evening, I could put on the first coat of Rubio Monocoat. I'm using walnut on walnut. Sounds a little perverse, but I find it adds a much more richer and true color to walnut than pure, which is what a lot of people use. Oh, hey, Jerry. How about you relocate yourself over there so I don't accidentally Rubio Monocoat you? So the way I apply this is just dip a white Scotch-Brite pad in the Rubio itself and rub it all over till it's on there, saturate it, let it sit, and then wipe it dry with a microfiber cloth, making sure that there's no excess left on the surface. And then back at Kevin's shop, I could get working on the underlayment for the canvas that will surround the gutter area of the shuffleboard table. Now, I found this carpet at Home Depot. I thought this would be a great idea to put down. It's got a nice little padding, add a little cushion. So I put some wood glue down, and as you can see right there, it just curled right back up. I said, oh, I'll just heat this thing and reactivate the glue, and this will work perfectly. And as you can see, it is doing absolutely nothing. So I read the label. Waterproof. So I put that on hold for a while, flipped this thing over, and coated the bottom of this with 3 coats of Total Boat Halcyon Clear varnish. And while my brain was mulling over an alternative underlayment material, I figure I may as well get this frame sanded. So I sanded all the outside edges, and then to actually sand the finer edges, I clamp on an extra piece here, which gives me basically a nice little outrigger for the sander. That way it doesn't rock back and forth and create rounded edges. Speaking of rounded edges, I put an 1/8 inch round over the entire frame just to ease those edges. Oh, don't worry, I didn't do the miters this time. Lesson learned. This right here, what the Oh boy. Can't tell you how much flack I've taken for that over the last year, and all well deserved. And once all the edges were rounded over, the surfaces sanded, I was ready to start applying the Rubio Monocoat. I started on the inside of the frame first, just working in that finish, made my way to the outside, and then rubbed off all the excess until it was dry to the touch. So my solution to the non-stick carpet dilemma was to put down cork. And I found this adhesive back cork. It only came in this specific size roll at Home Depot. So I just cut it into strips, used a roller to try to get out any air bubbles. And you'll see right there, you notice that little washboard effect going on? Well, I didn't really see it at the time, and it's gonna rear its ugly head here very shortly. And with the cork patch quilted all the way down, I could cut off all the excess and then lay out the canvas. I got this at Jo-Ann Fabrics. That's right, I shop at Jo-Ann Fabrics. So this is just kind of really heavy-duty, rugged canvas, gray, and fortunately, you have to buy the whole sheet. Now it was time to spread some glue again, which I knew this canvas would stick to the glue because we've done it before, and I knew the glue would stick to the cork because I had done it before. So I spread everything out. I actually put 2 layers of glue on here because it kind of soaked it up a little bit. Then with Kevin's help, we could drape this over and then start smoothing it out using hand pressure first and then an iron, which does a great job of keeping that glue warm while at the same time eliminating the wrinkles from the canvas. Then I could trim off all the waste and see the horrific problem before me, which was the washboard cork effect. So, peeled it back, and in my brain, I'm like, all right, so what am I going to get now to cover this cork? And then Kevin said, hey, why don't you just sand it smooth? And by golly, it worked. It worked a treat, as they say. Sanded it all smooth and then reapplied the glue with a roller. I used 2 coats this time as well. And then reapplied the canvas, which, as I mentioned before, you have to buy the whole thing. Thank goodness. So I had a duplicate piece ready to go. So I ironed it smooth and then trimmed off the excess, and it looked perfect. And then I was back to my shop to install the leg levelers in the legs. I'm putting this little recess in here first, which will handle the T-nut, make sure it's flush, and then using a laser to make sure I'm going straight in. I'm making a 2-stepped hole, one for the bolts and one for the actual shaft of the T-nut. Then I can just simply bang that in flush and then screw in this leg leveler, which is just over 2 inches, I believe, in diameter. And then it was back to Mike and Tim's shop at True Trade Carpentry, where they put that big old Laguna CNC to work for me to flatten out these epoxy samples, which revealed some interesting results underneath, some good, some bad. This one right here, as you can see, it looks like some kind of flames going on here. This is the one the client liked the best, which I was super happy with. They didn't want to go the tomato milquetoast route. They wanted something organic and cool looking, and I think they got it. And while I was over at True Trade, I had them do the final flattening pass, cleaning up that epoxy and making sure that this playing deck was perfectly flat on both sides. And then I could wrestle it back into my shop, do the final sanding before I inlay the logo. But first, let's do the logo. So after this was sanded, it ended up being about 9/16 thick. So I routed a pocket in this MDF. There's just some tape here for some padding. I went a little too deep. So now I can set this in here, nice and flush, put some more shaper tape, and then I can route this out. And then I quickly screwed everything down to secure it and got to cutting. Now, whatever size I make this is the exact size that I'm going to need to route in the shuffleboard deck for this to fit into. Now, I did cut small tabs in this to make sure that the circle didn't release itself as I was going around, and then I secured it with tape and then cleaned up those tabs. And then I could unclench the old cheeks because it came out without any chips or any other damage. Looks good. Now, I'm really unable to capture how much time this actually took to get the diameter of this inlaid circle exact to match the epoxy circle. But after much fitting and fixing and fiddling, I finally got it. There was a super delicate balance between it being too loose and being a gap around and being too tight when I go to bang it in and it cracking or breaking. So I just kept creeping up on it 1,000th at a time until I got it. And to secure the logo in the pocket, I'm just using some Total Boat 4-minute epoxy. Don't need a lot here, just want to make sure this thing isn't going to want to creep up, even though it is an extremely tight fit and there's probably no chance of that happening, but it doesn't hurt to play it safe. And then it was the moment of truth. Now, I knew it fit in the top. Was it going to fit in all the way down without cracking or splitting or some other catastrophic event? And I also recessed it 1/16 of an inch below the surface. That way I could pour clear epoxy on top of it. And then I hit my next speed bump when I was attempting to mount the legs to the mounting plates. Oh, As you can see here, the holes don't quite line up. Jason.
Hello?
Dude.
What's up?
Hey, I'm trying to match up these shuffleboard legs with the mounting plates. I ordered the exact same ones, but nothing lines up.
Okay. What do you need me for?
Do you remember if we did anything special with these or anything like that?
Dude, I already built this table for you once. Why don't you just fucking figure it out? All right, don't call here again.
And with those encouraging and inspirational words, I realized there's only one thing to do, and that was cut the top off these legs. They were just a little too tall. Apparently, when we had built this before, we made them smaller. Unfortunately, these were already finished with 2 coats of Rubio, and my table saw was disgusting, so at 1 in the morning, I was cleaning and re-waxing my table saw so it wouldn't scratch these things up. I reset up the L fence and made the cuts, and all was well again. I laid everything out, used double-sided tape to stick these down, and then I could flip this thing over and then mark all the holes so I could drill for my threaded inserts. And just like the leg levelers, I used a laser here to make sure I was going in vertical. And I'm using this little depth stop here that you can tighten around your bits, and they fit various sizes. I'll put a link to them below. It's actually pretty cool. It's about $15, but I'm pretty happy with it so far. And I countersink and drive those threaded inserts home. And then I could do my final sanding to the top playing deck before applying finish. Oh, hello, Jerry. Is this disturbing you? Oh, forgot about the 1/8 inch round over on all these edges. Make sure those are nice and smooth and agreeable to the touch. Now, he doesn't like the vacuum, but he does seem to like the vacuum brush, or at least tolerates it. And then it was Rubio time. A sprinkle and a squeegee, and then a white Scotch-Brite pad to work it all into the pores and grain, and then a microfiber cloth to wipe off all the excess. Now, I did put an additional coat on this 48 hours later, and in fact, I put a 3rd coat on this because it still was a little dull in a few places. And then a couple days later, it was final assembly time and delivery day. Now, although Smith & Steel out in Oregon did an amazing job plasma cutting these plates and getting to me so fast, the plasma cutting left these holes a little askew, so I had to run over to the boys at Liquid Metal Works just to enlarge them for me a little bit, and then these bolts went in no problem. And then it was time to load this deck up and get it over to Kevin's for the final assembly, which proved to be difficult by myself navigating my little shop here.
Sawhorse up. Oh boy.
Ever have a wedgie from a sawhorse? Get out! And once the sawhorse was removed from my posterior, I was able to get this thing loaded in the truck. And for the final assembly, I called yet again upon my mustachio-wearing friend, Ryan Carlin, and we got to assembling. First step was to move the canvas laced plywood on top of the playing deck, where we peppered it heavily with screws, then moved that off the bench, moved the frame into place, and now we could move the playing deck mounted to the plywood and drop it into the rabbet on the underside of the frame. And it was heavy as all get out, so Ryan got his end in first, and then I couldn't get my hands out, so he ran down and propped it up, and we were able to drop it in. And then it was just a matter of putting the screws back into the holes when we had dry fit this piece to begin with. The last step was to get the legs and their mounting plates actually mounted to the underside of the table, so I made sure they were the correct spacing. Now, since I decided to use bolts and washers to attach the mounting plates to the legs, they were sitting proud of the mounting plates. So I had to recess some holes, so I used a Forstner bit, which would account for the washer, and then came back with a regular Forstner bit, which would account for the head of the screw. And then we could drill for the hanger bolt installation, which would allow us to securely fasten the plates and the legs to the underside of the table right into the walnut playing deck. And I used some 4-minute epoxy just to make sure those bolts were nice and solid in their respective holes. And then once on site in the client's office, just outside of Philadelphia, PA, I could get these legs mounted, get all these nuts tightened and secured, and then it was time for the reveal. Now bear in mind, this is my first time flipping this thing over, seeing it completely assembled at the same time that the client is seeing it assembled for the first time. So this was super exciting. I was super happy with it. You can see the smile on his face. We were both loving it. Now you might be wondering the color scheme of this whole thing with the white numbers and lines and the gray gutter. Well, LAUDA Brinkmann's corporate colors, since they make chillers, is a white chiller, gray type, and then the red and blue logo. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to try out the table myself, but it was properly broken in at the office opening gala a couple of nights later, and despite the adult beverages, I'm told it sustained no perceivable damage. Although I built the bulk of this table myself, I didn't do it alone. A huge thank you to Kevin at Fine Point for his shop space and assistance, Ryan Carlin for his assistance, True Trade Carpentry for the CNC help, and Smith & Steel and Liquid Metalworks for the steel assistance. And of course, to my buddy, Nick Key, for editing the majority of the footage of this video. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to check out one of these two or both of these videos until my next one hits the channel.